courses and e-learning resources to complement that. And we've recently launched a tool called AI Course Creator, which the name sort of says it all what that tool does. I am joined by Katya Holker from Hawkeye Consultancy. Did you want to introduce yourself, Katya?
Thank you, Harmony. Hi, everyone online. I'm Katya. I'm from Hawkeye Consultancy. Great to be here with everyone today. Hawkeye Consultancy offers a variety of different services across auditing, validation, which is good topic that we're going to be talking about today. But essentially what we do at Hawkeye is help RTO stress less about compliance. So yeah, very excited to be here and to go through validation with everyone.
Awesome. And we're also joined by Jano Espinosa. He's on our the eSkilled team. He's going to be monitoring the chat function. So feel free to send through any questions you have at any time throughout the presentation. We should have some time left over at the end of the session for Q&A. Anything we don't have time to answer today or we don't have an answer for on the spot, we'll formulate a response, a written response to, and we'll share that via email after the session. There is also a certificate issued automatically via email from this session for your professional development records. Okay, so just want to acknowledge, do a little acknowledgement of country. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways throughout Australia. We pay respect to all elders past, present, and emerging, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in today's session. So for our session, what we'll cover off today is what's changed under the new RTO standards, understand the role and purpose of validation in assessment practices, recognize the practical implications of validation for compliance and quality training outcomes, apply the principles of assessment and rules of evidence when conducting validation, identify key steps in pre-validation, moderation, and post-validation, develop effective validation questions aligned with unit requirements, and how systems and AI can simplify the validation process. And we'll also provide some AI validation prompts for free. Okay, so firstly, we'll touch on what's changed regarding validation under the new 2025 standards. So validation frequency and planning. Under the standards for RTOs in 2015, every training product had to be validated at least once in 5 years. At least 50% of the products had to be validated in the first 3 years of the cycle. And RTOs needed a written validation plan outlining timing, products, participants, and how improvements would be actioned. Under the new standards, the maximum 5-year cycle remains, but the approach is now risk-based. RTOs must conduct validation more frequently where risks, product changes, or stakeholder feedback indicate that it's needed. The sample size for validation is also risk-based, but there's no longer a reference to a statistically valid sample. RTOs must demonstrate how validation outcomes are used to improve the assessment system. So the key shift here is the new standards remove rigid quotas and instead emphasize professional judgment. RTOs must decide what needs validating more urgently and based on risk factors and justify these decisions accordingly. So who can validate? Under the 2015 standards, validators had to collectively hold a vocational competency relevant to the unit being validated, current industry skills, current knowledge of VET teaching and learning, and the appropriate TAE qualification. People involved in the design or delivery of the assessment could take part, provided they weren't solely responsible for determining outcomes. Under the new standards, the requirements are clearer and are tied to the new credential policy. So validators must have industry competencies and a practical understanding of current workplace practice. They must hold one of the approved validation credentials. And crucially, the person who designed or delivered the assessment cannot solely determine outcomes. So the key shift is under the new standards, more clarity is provided by codifying exactly which credentials are acceptable for validation, reducing the ambiguity and strengthening independence. So independent validation for TAE. Under the 2015 standards, RTOs delivering TAE training and assessment qualifications or assessor skill sets had to undergo independent validation of their assessment tools, processes, and outcomes. Under the new standards, the requirements continue, but is now more explicit. So validation must be conducted after the first cohort completes a TAE qualification or skill set that enables assessors to make assessment judgments. It must be undertaken by an independent person, so someone not employed or subcontracted by the RTO to train or assess in those products. So the key shift here, independence is more clearly defined, ensuring that validation of TAE qualifications remains impartial and credible. So pre-use review of assessment tools. Under the old standards, there was no explicit requirement for pre-use review, although many RTOs did this as best practice. Under the new standards, Standard 1.3 introduces a new obligation. RTOs must review assessment tools before they are used. This is not considered validation in the technical sense. Validators and validation credentials are not required for this review. The aim is to simply check tools for completeness and appropriateness before rollout. So the key shift is RTOs must now build a formal pre-use review step into their processes, reducing the risk of non-compliance before assessments begin. And lastly, documentation and continuous improvement. Under the old standards, RTOs were required to keep a documented plan, record validation activities, and note improvements. Under the new standards, documentation requirements are now framed around being able to demonstrate a structured and risk-based approach, including why a certain training product or samples were selected, how validator credentials and independence were established, how validation outcomes have fed into continuous improvement. So the shift here is from record keeping to evidencing a risk-based continuous improvement process. So I'll hand it over now to Katya to talk to us about validation mastery. Oh, you're on mute. Still on mute.
Can everyone hear me okay? Hello?
Now we can. Excellent.
Okay, apologies, sorry. I'm not sure what happened there. And everyone can see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Hopefully it's showing the PowerPoint of the structure of the revised standards. And so what I wanted to just bring a step back, first of all, was to make sure that everyone's aware of the three main documents that currently make up the revised quality framework. They include the outcome standards, the credentials policy, and the compliance requirements. So they are the key three documents. It's not just the outcome standards in isolation. And you will see that they have been separated into the outcome standards document, which speaks to all of the actual standards we need to follow. They're the ones that are very much less prescriptive and allow the opportunity for a provider to actually demonstrate through various documentation or through practices, how they're actually meeting the intent and achieving that outcome of that standard. Then we have the credential policy, which feeds into quality area 3, which is the vet workforce, and also into quality area 1, looking at validations, and in particular the credentials in which people who deliver training and assessment services or undertake validation activities and those credentials that they need to hold. And then we have the compliance requirements documents. These compliance requirements documents are very kind of black and white, and they're the things that every provider must meet. Things like using the NRTO logo correctly and the AQF logo, and then the data provision requirements and financial viability. And so if you haven't already looked at those documents, I would definitely invite you to have a look at them. They are available by from DUA's website. DUA is the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations, and they're the ones who have actually released these documents. ASWA are the regulator, meaning they will actually regulate you against those documents. And so always important, I think, to bring it back to that, just so you know where to get the actual information from. And the quality outcome standards are what we're going to be focusing on today, in particular looking at how validation fits into quality area 1, training and assessment. So the quality outcome, or the outcome standards, are divided into 4 quality areas. 1, training and assessment, as I mentioned. 2, learner support. 3, the vet workforce. And then finally 4, governance. Now, even though we're looking at the training and assessment or quality area, and in particular standards 1.3, 1.4, and 1.5, there are areas of these activities or the validation activities that will actually form into other areas. And what we like to call it a Hawkeye, the kind of domino effect. So they do feed into other areas. For example, if we validate and we do validation of assessment judgments, which identify some improvements for our instructions, well, then that would actually feed into our governance, into our continuous improvement. So I wanted to just give a quick overview of the structure of the outcome standards, because they are very different as well in how they've actually been formatted. So you can see at the top, we have the quality area that I've previously mentioned, which is accompanied by a quality outcome statement. Now, the quality outcome statement is a kind of overarching statement, which then feeds directly into the actual standard that you need to achieve. Each of the standards is broken into focus areas. The focus areas is the area that particular standard and its sub-performance indicators actually relate to. So it is very important. I'm sure a lot of people have heard that they are a lot less prescriptive, meaning that in some instances the standard, while you need to meet that, the performance indicators might actually list items that are not relevant to your organization based on your scope or the context of your delivery or your cohort. Work placement is a very good example of that. There's a key performance indicator in one of them that talks around placement and ensuring facilities and access in that actual environment. If you don't have placement, then that wouldn't be relevant to you. However, I would still advise you and recommend that as a best practice method, that you still document that maybe in somewhere or in a TAS policy document, that particular performance indicator is not relevant to you given your cohort or the context or whatever that reason might be. Now, this structure is very similar to anyone that's familiar with the early learning framework or early childhood learning framework, and they followed a similar approach. But it is, as I can't stress enough, less prescriptive, which means it will be really up to you as a provider to provide guidance to an auditor on how and what you're using to form not only your judgments of what you're going to achieve, but then how you actually achieve that. So, validation, what we're going to be looking at today, and I am one of those really nerdy weirdos, if anyone's online that knows that I really actually love validation. It was one of the first things that I ever started to do. within an organization with an RTO that I started with about 12 years ago. And I just found it very fascinating looking at the aspects of an assessment system and how we could improve that for our students. So very happy to go through this in quite some detail. If there is any questions or if anyone is unsure, as Harmony mentioned, there is a Q&A at the end. So please feel free to put any questions into the chat. And if there's anything that isn't answered, then you're also very welcome to contact me through LinkedIn or through my email to ask. Because sometimes questions can't be answered without further context. So I sometimes might need that information. But what is validation? So looking at validation and how it's changed, Harmony mentioned earlier some of the key requirements that have actually changed from the 2015 to 2025 standards. Now it is, in terms of what has changed, there is the requirement for the pre-validation or prior to use, and making sure that the tools are fit for purpose, that they're consistent with the training package requirements. And as Harmony mentioned, that was a best practice process prior. However, it is now a requirement. So when I'm going to be talking about validation, we at Hawkeye talk about it as an overall process that's then broken down into three key areas or three key activities for validation. And those activities include what we call pre-validation, which is that prior to use. We then also have a moderation, which I'll get into shortly. And then finally, we have validation of assessment judgments. So I'll give you a bit more information on them later when we'll actually go through that and give you some tips of what to look for. So validation is very much a compliance obligation. There is legal requirements. It is listed within the standards that we undertake prior use or look at a system prior. The best way to do that is to undertake a pre-validation of something. It also allows us to actually ensure that we're meeting industry standards or community-based standards as well. It allows us to effectively confirm whether competency measurements such as performance criteria, assessment conditions, knowledge, etc. have actually been met, and if not, actually allow us to identify that there are gaps. Now, all of this is really to inform best practice and continuous improvement so that we're using or we're identifying issues and actually using that information to refine our tools. And that information could be from validation of the pre-validation, where we're identifying gaps within the tool itself, or it could be from post or validation of assessment judgments, where we're actually identifying that students are getting the same question wrong, for example, on multiple occasions. Well, is that maybe something we need to identify? Is the question too ambiguous? So definitions are very important to have a look at. So there are some definitions that are now newly listed under the outcome standards at the start of the very long policy document. But I would recommend that you have a look at them and make sure that they are in alignment to what you define each of these items within your organization. So we'll be having a look at the assessment judgment. So that essentially means the determination of whether competency has been achieved by the student and whether that's consistent with the training product and the actual assessment tools. We'll be looking at the assessment system. So the terminology in the standards does refer to the whole system. So not just things in isolation or assessment items in silos. It's actually looking at the whole assessment system, which means that coordinated set of documents, policies, procedures, assessment tools that you've designed to ensure that the assessment the student's undertaking, and that does include recognition of prior learning, actually is going to allow you to produce consistent and valid judgments of students' competency. And that they're meeting the requirements and the intended outcome of that unit of competency. Assessment tools. So this is looking at the actual assessment instruments, the instructions, the methods that you're using to gather and interpret assessment evidence, and for the purpose of determining the VET student's competence. So again, assessment tools need to be looked at from the context and the condition of the assessment, the tasks that are being administered to the student, an outline of the actual assessment evidence that needs to be gathered by the student, the criteria in which needs to be assessed against to form that judgment of competence, and the administration and recording, as well as reporting requirements for assessment and assessment evidence. We also have terms like principles of assessment and rules of evidence, and these should be embedded into your validation activities. So I'm hoping if you have any validation tools, that it does specifically give guidance as to what types of questions would allow you to actually meet these principles of assessment. Now, don't worry too much. We do have some tips later on that I'll go through, and I can share some guiding questions for you to add to your tools if you want. But essentially, when we're looking at the principles of assessment, it means making sure that it's fair, i.e. that it's going to accommodate the needs of the learner, including allowing for reasonable adjustments where appropriate, and where appropriate, not changing the actual outcome of that assessment or altering the level or AQF level of a question or of what you're trying to assess the student on. That there's actual flexibility. So assessment is appropriate within the context, the training product, and the student, and assesses the student's skills and knowledge and is relevant to that training product, regardless of where or how that student actually acquires those skills or knowledge. Making sure that assessment considers the individual student's needs, their learning styles, and the existing knowledge of that as well. And also that there's a variety of assessment methods allowed to be used to accommodate diverse learning needs or learning contexts and students' backgrounds too. Validity, so having a look at the practical application components that enable the VET student to demonstrate the relevant skills and knowledge and in that practical setting. So this means ensuring that the assessments are aligned to the training product and requirements, and not just one or two parts of the actual requirements, all of them. Knowledge and skills are demonstrated through practical application and within the actual correct environment to do so as well. So having a look at those assessment conditions to see if there's any particular resources or equipment or simulated setups that need to actually be adhered to. And that the full range of the required skills and knowledge is actually assessed. Reliability, making sure that when we have an assessment, that assessment evidence is actually allowed to be interpreted consistently among our assessors, and that the outcomes of those judgments are comparable irrespective of which assessor is conducting an assessment. And I'll never forget when I was in one of my very first ASCO audits about 12 years ago. This was brought up as a key point, and the assessor gave me the advice, which I kind of really did stick with me. If I was an assessor as an auditor, I would have to be able to see that that judgment could be made no matter which student undertook the assessment, and that piece of evidence that you present could actually be given to another assessor and they could make that same judgment without having actually seen that student do that. That based on the evidence presented to them, that it should be clearly documented, there should be clear information around assessment methodology, around the instructions, that they could form that same judgment. And I thought that was really good advice. So making sure essentially that those assessment outcomes are comparable across different assessors, and that they contain clear criteria to really support that consistent judgment. ASCO would do in your audit reports clearly list the principles of assessment in which you have been deemed non-compliant against, and something as small as, and I'll use an example, which was under the term fairness, by where a student, or validity, sorry, a question just said, provide examples. They deemed it non-compliant because, well, provide how many examples? How much information does a student actually need to give to be deemed competent for that question? So if you're looking at writing a question that says provide examples, maybe say provide 2 examples, or if you just want them to briefly explain something, then actually list that, and then in the benchmark answers make sure that you have something that's briefly explaining it, or that you have 2 examples if that's how you've written the question. Rules of evidence. So looking at the rules of evidence, such as validity, so making sure that the assessment evidence is adequate, such that the assessor can be reasonably assured that the VET student possesses the skills and knowledge described in the training product. So ensuring that it's directly aligned with the unit of competencies requirements, and that it is within that context as well, and the context that's required, the outcome that they're going to achieve. It's sufficient. So this is a very important one as well, sufficiency, but I would always recommend looking at quality over quantity. I know that sufficiency would make you think, oh, I'll just get loads and loads of evidence and then that would be sufficient. It still needs to be quality. So quality over quantity, but you still need to have enough quantity wise to actually satisfy, and that evidence needs to be relevant to the assessment that's being undertaken. And all of them should really, or sorry, the quality, quantity, and relevance should really enable the assessor to make an informed judgment of that student's competence in the skills and knowledge described in the training product. Rules of evidence are also important in both or any type of assessment outcome, but also very important when we're looking at things like recognition of prior learning. So a wide range and depth of evidence is actually collected and includes enough quality to support an informed decision about competence. Authenticity as well, so making sure as an assessor or the tool itself that there are areas that you can ensure that it is the student's actual own assessment, and that assessment evidence is the original and genuine work of that student. Looking at students, if they are using references, if they're allowed to cite material, making sure that that information is clearly provided to them. There's a big hot topic at the moment about AI and the use of AI in academic integrity. Authenticity is going to be something that is likely to be looked at in more in depth by ASQA, particularly for a risk rating. They are looking at the forms of AI, and we've seen providers, one provider in particular, being closed down for students using AI for all of their assessments. So I would be looking at practices and mechanisms for you to actually, first of all, step back and make sure that you're clearly informing students around what is acceptable use of AI, and where possible, don't be afraid of it. See if you can actually embed it into the actual assessment, but of course getting them to use it in an effective way. So you might give them a case study, they might have to research something, they could research it using AI, but they need to still critically analyze the information. I wouldn't stay away from AI, but making sure that the acceptable use policy is actually provided to students so that they're aware, and that you have other mechanisms to actually ensure the authenticity of that. There's some good softwares available, and there's also, you know, things like student declarations, there's also things like competency conversations, so you can have discussions with students if you somehow feel that maybe a student might not be presenting authentic evidence to you. As an assessor, you can definitely have a conversation with them and see, you know, if they're giving you those same types of answers and have an understanding of what they've presented. If not, then you're absolutely fine to, you know, not make that judgment. And then finally, around rules of evidence is the currency. So the assessment evidence presented to the assessor documents and demonstrates the student's current, very important, current skills and knowledge, and ensuring evidence demonstrates that the skills and knowledge are recent and reflect current capabilities. So Types of validation activities. As I mentioned earlier, at Hawkeye, we like to break validation down into 3 key activities. And they actually kind of happen at different stages of the student journey, or different stages of your governance and overarching systems, I suppose. And the types of validation that we would recommend are pre-assessment validation. So this is the practice that occurs before you as a provider implement a new assessment tool or system, or also as a continuous improvement opportunity. This will help you support standard 1.3, which talks about that reviewing tools prior to use. Now, again, they are less prescriptive, so the depth in which you review them is completely up to you, but I would just give you the advice that the standard itself specifies that you review them to ensure that the training or that the assessment is going to be consistent with the training product or the training package. The only way to really do that and make sure that the training product requirements have been met is to undertake a validation by where you're looking at all of the criteria against the particular assessment tool to see if they're actually aligned. There are other ways also. You could maybe look at doing a what we're calling internally a fit for purpose tool, or like a sample validation approach. But again, those aren't likely to show you the full depth of issues if you only take a sample, and may not allow you to fully ensure that the assessment system itself is compliant with all of the training package requirements. So just keep that in mind. We have moderation. This always seems to be a question that I get asked a lot when I'm delivering, in terms of moderation used to be in the all standards. They then got rid of it. Well, they didn't get rid of it, but they got rid of it from their guidance documents. And no one really understood. But at Hawkeye, what we suggest moderation be is actually a quality control process that occurs prior to the final assessment judgment being made. So it's essentially a process, a quality assurance or self-assurance process, by where the assessors are going to moderate the file before they make an assessment decision. And that will allow them to come to the consensus about that decision and whether someone has actually made competence. So if an assessment for one unit of competency, for example, has a written knowledge set of questions, it has a case study, it has a practical observation, and then it has a logbook because it's got placement hours, well, then you have some type of document, and an assessment outcome or an outcome cover sheet works quite well to show moderation. A lot of providers are actually already using this, by where the assessment outcome cover sheet will have those 4 assessment items that align directly to what's listed in the mapping tool and also with what's in the actual assessment itself, and has an area to say, yes, I have seen, and they are all each satisfactory, and those items are allowing me to form that judgment of competence. Now, there are other ways that you can capture moderation too. You could actually look at moderating the file prior to the data being entered. So maybe making it an admin process instead of it being, or not even instead, but additionally to having your assessors do it, is having some type of data entry checklist to make sure, or have teaching your admin to make sure that they're checking that the assessment outcome page, if being used, has all of the satisfactory outcomes, and the assessment evidence is actually accompanying that before it's being entered. And these are just all small self-assurance mechanisms that can allow you to ensure that you have the correct evidence on file if needed for audit. And remember, we now need to keep completed assessment items from 2 years from the date that the training product has been finished. So no longer just that 6-month period, it's now a 2-year period under the new standards. So this will help you provide evidence for that. And then finally, the last validation activity that we would suggest you undertake is the validation of assessment judgments, or some people call it post-validation. And this directly supports standard 1.5. And it used to be across standards 1.9 to 1.11, and looking at your validation. But essentially, it's the process of conducting a validation of the assessments once the assessment judgment has actually been made and it has occurred to review a significant sample of a completed assessment. So it actually involves evaluating whether the judgment made by the assessor is actually valid, reliable, sufficient, current, and authentic, and whether the tools that were used were actually effective in measuring the required confidence that was provided. So pre-validation, and this is clause 1.3. Well, what we're aligning our practices at Hawkeye from pre-validation and suggesting our clients do. And as Harmony mentioned, a lot of people were already undertaking a review of their assessment system prior. While it wasn't required under the old standards, it was a best practice model. So we would suggest that you keep doing that. However, now that what was a best practice model has now become mandated, we would invite you to kind of consider internally, well, what can we do to further enhance our validation activities? And maybe that's a more stringent type of moderation process, or it could be looking at, well, maybe we keep our own valid samples and we keep that same approach. But whatever that is for you, making sure that it is clearly documented in some type of policy or an outline so that you can present to ASCWA how you're meeting each of these standards. So pre-validation, the assessment system is essentially fit for purpose and consistent with the training product. And so there's some performance indicators, making sure that, as I mentioned, consistent with that training product. And here's that big keyword, that prior to use. So assessment tools are reviewed prior to use to ensure assessment can be conducted in a way that's consistent with the principles of assessment and rules of evidence. And also that the outcomes of any such reviews are inform any necessary changes to the assessment tools. So if you are reviewing a tool and you've documented and you've identified some gaps, not just saying, oh, okay, we'll fix that, but then not actually fixing it or not allowing that to actually inform any of the changes that are going to be required for that assessment system. Who can participate in pre-validation? So pre-validation, or that fit for purpose, is actually not specified in the credential policy. So anyone with knowledge of the principles of assessment and rules of evidence can actually undertake it. And we would suggest, though, as a best practice method, that you can have someone who is TAE qualified as well as also industry expertise, because essentially you should have someone that has that industry knowledge to inform whether it's actually consistent with the training product. Is it using the correct terminology? Is it up to date with industry standards, etc.? And someone who may just have knowledge of the principles of assessment and rules of evidence may not know that. But essentially, under the standards, there are no credential requirements, but we would suggest best practice that they have a mix of vet and industry knowledge. Steps in pre-validation, what this looks like, and we would suggest that you actually define the scope of pre-validation. So again, this is dependent on the context of your RTO and the size and your scope. And again, to Harmony's point, looking at a risk-based approach. ASCWA recently released their 2025 to 2026 risk priority ratings. I would highly invite you or recommend that you go and have a look at those. There is the use of AI, online delivery, so use that information that's there to actually inform the priority of what you're going and how, sorry, the priority for which you're going to undertake your pre and post validation as well. Defining the scope of the pre-validation, are you going to be looking at each unit and validate each single unit? Are you going to take a sample approach and look at only 2 units from a qualification, and then if that identifies issues, you will validate more? But essentially you need to be defining it and actually outlining that. make sure whatever you're putting in your documentation is actually going to be achievable. As an auditor, we will go and look for the document. We will then go and see and read it, and it could have all the bells and whistles. But at the end of the day, if your practices aren't aligning or you don't have any evidence to show that you have followed that and the intent of that, well, then you are non-compliant against your own policy. So I would recommend that you have a look at that and actually come up with what's achievable. ASPO haven't given any guidance as to what they want to see. So previously we would see 2 units from any full qualification had to be done. This is actually up to you to determine. But again, I would look at the terminology that was specified, and it said assessment tools are reviewed prior to use to ensure consistency with the training product. So the training product could be a qualification, a unit of competency, a skill set, or an accredited course. But if you undertake pre-validation, it gives you a lot more confidence when you go to do your validation of assessment judgments that you've made sound judgments, because the tool that they have initially used has already identified gaps or improvements and should already have been rectified. Step 2 in validation, looking at assembling a team if possible. So that's where I mentioned having someone that's TAE qualified as well as industry. However, again, there's no definite need for that, but best practice, we would recommend that you have someone with either or a collective team. Looking at the actual training package requirements. So this includes looking at the assessment conditions as well as anything that's listed or might be listed in the contextualization implementation guides that are available from training.gov. Also considering any feedback that you've gathered, maybe through stakeholder engagement, such as industry, community, or even student feedback. So that can be informed into this validation process as well. It involves actually looking at the assessment tools as step 4 outlines. So examining the assessment tools against the assessment mapping or mapping matrix. Again, I get asked a lot, do we have to have a mapping tool? Under the standards, there is nowhere that states you need a mapping tool. However, the importance of having a mapping document is that auditors are not always industry experts. And auditors are also quite costly. So audits can cost anywhere from about $4,000 to, I've seen some of them go up to $20,000 to $25,000 you pay per hour per auditor. So I would highly recommend that you give a validation tool to a mapping tool to an auditor, so that you're clearly advising them or showing them where exactly in the assessment tool certain criteria is being met. Number 5, so identify gaps. So going through the actual assessment. So when you're looking at the unit requirements, looking at terms used, performance criteria, performance elements, as it suggests they need to be performed. So a student can't write how they would perform it. They need to actually be observed performing that. Looking at terms like verbs are acts of doing. So ideally a student should actually be performing that or doing that. And looking at the different types of documents or supplementary things that the student might actually need to create from that actual assessment. Things like a report, or some units have that they need to give photos. Have you actually allowed within the instructions to both the student and the assessor to actually capture that? And are the instructions clear? Bringing back to what's in the principles of assessment, are they going to allow us to actually allow a student to understand what is expected of them and undertake that? And then record validation findings and amend the tool. If you have a validation register or a similar document, I would recommend that you have those listed there. I would also recommend for anyone that already had a validation register that you actually update it to capture that outcome, so that how that outcome of that has actually informed changes to it. It just gives a clear snapshot on one place to provide to someone in the event that you need it. And then making sure you follow any internal document control procedures before finally approving the tool for use, and making sure that you circulate that and that all people have access to the current version of the tool. current and improved. So looking at some effective pre-validations, and I'm so sorry, I've actually been off sick with the flu, so I just need to take some water. So if I lose my voice, I'm sorry in advance. So looking at some effective pre-validation questions, so does the assessment task align clearly with the elements and performance criteria, performance evidence and performance knowledge and evidence, and the actual assessment conditions, as well as the foundation skills. And so often I see that people don't map, or they don't even look at the foundations. If they're explicitly listed, please make sure that you actually look at those. Are the assessment tools designed at the appropriate level and reflecting that the required complexity and autonomy that's actually required? Looking at the tools, and are they providing sufficient opportunities for students to actually demonstrate competence across all dimensions? So is there task management and task skills? Is it in the correct job environment? Is there contingency where possible, etc.? Having inadequate or inaccurate mapping tools is also one that I see often in audits, or where a mapping tool hasn't been updated against the actual updated assessment, so there's no clear alignment, or you can't show the clear link between the tasks and the inner requirements. And then, are the assessment instructions clear? So do they actually allow, as I mentioned earlier, a student to fully understand what's required of them? And are they, unbiased, clear from ambiguity? That's a big one we see very often. They're too ambiguous, or they might be set in a way that it is a what and how type question, and that really should be broken into two questions to allow a student time to reflect on, okay, first I need to provide what, and then I need to provide how, instead of describe how or what and how you might do something. So I would recommend that you space out questions where possible, so that students can actually remember to give, well, I need to give a question or an answer to both of these types of items. Also helps assessors when they're going to mark information too. So steps in moderation, excuse me. So first step is looking at how moderation and procedures actually conducted internally for you. So as I mentioned earlier, that could be some of those examples, like an outcome cover sheet, or maybe a data entry or validation checklist prior to entering the data, but essentially coming up and defining what that looks like for you internally. And it really does mean making sure that you're confirming that the assessment tools required and the assessment methods required to deem that competency are actually moderated and have actually are all contained within the file and that have made that judgment. 3, actually looking at the student being moderated. Were there any notes on the student's file? Were there any information around reasonable adjustments, for example? They should be considered when you're looking at moderating that file too, because they could alter, I suppose, the assessment methodology potentially. Number 4 as well is looking at opportunity to provide feedback to students where possible. So this should allow your assessors, if they're missing anything, to go back to students, or in the event that you're using an admin process prior to data entry, they can still go back to the assessor and ask for more information or more evidence. Again, all of validation activities are part of your self-assurance activities. They are to allow you to identify continuous improvements and where possible. So making sure if you do identify anything that you're clearly documenting that maybe in your continuous improvement register, or you're actually using the feedback and actually allowing it to inform best practices moving forward. If in the event that the last you've done all of that and you do identify some discrepancies, step 6 is really to make sure that you're actually discussing those discrepancies with either the student or the trainer. Maybe it's how they've marked it, but making sure that that information is actually discussed and there's that open communication between all parties involved. So some effective moderation questions for you. Are the assessment decisions consistent, and can they be applied across different assessment tasks for the same unit? So looking at patterns or discrepancies in how competencies actually been made. Have assessors maybe or students altered? I've had instances where my students have actually altered the assessment and they put it into a PDF writer, and they've rewritten it and taken off like a whole section. So actually looking at, is there questions within your moderation to not only look at the outcome cover sheet, but to ensure that each of the actual assessment tasks within an overall assessment have actually been provided and are actually confident. Is the assessment provided by students interpreted in a consistent and fair manner? So those examples I mentioned earlier, is there clear and consistent information to students? Is it fair? Are you giving them information around reasonable adjustments, appeals processes? And are assessors actually ensuring they're applying the same standard and same criteria across all students? Do all assessors have a shared understanding of the unit requirements and the actual benchmark answers that you accept internally or as an organization? So I would recommend that you confirm with everyone to ensure that they're on all aligned, and that we're making sure that we are gaining consistent and sufficient and valid evidence from students. If you identify through a process that, well, this type of answer could actually be accepted from a student, what is the actual improvement process to maybe add that answer to the benchmark? So looking at the actual process that lies behind that, so that trainers or admin are aware of the avenues to actually continuously improve. And then have any discrepancies or disagreements in assessment outcomes been discussed and resolved cooperatively or collaboratively? So moderation should really include dialogue and census building amongst assessors. So I recommend that you have a look at that and have them involved when they're coming up, them being assessors involved when they're coming up with the actual benchmark responses, or when you're reviewing that, get their input. And that can occur in pre-validation, moderation, or even post-validation as well. And then finally, are there actual documented actions, or do you have somewhere as a central location to form that best movement or best practice model? And making sure that the assessment moderation leads to tangible improvements and those updates to tools or even guidance to students as well. And then the last activity is validation of assessment judgments. So this is the one in relation directly to standard 1.5, whereby the assessment system is quality assured by appropriate skilled and credentials persons through a regular process of validating assessment practices and judgments. That is a mouthful, sorry. But looking at this one, this was very similar to what we had in the old standards, just some further, I suppose, wording changes. The performance indicators are looking at the assessment practices and judgments to ensure that the assessment system as a whole is going to allow you to produce assessment judgments that were consistent with the training product, and that they comply with the requirements set out in the actual standards, principles of assessment, rules of evidence. And so in this one, this is the one that actually has the credentials, so who can participate in validation. It can be undertaken by one or more people who collectively have industry competencies, skills and knowledge relevant to the training product. And I would suggest currency, so looking at, well, what level, if you're bringing in industry, what level of current information are they allowed to give you, real informed best practices currently being done in industry. A practical understanding of current industry practices relevant to that training product, so not just the knowledge, actual practical application and understanding of how that applies in the workplace. And then one of the credentials for validation actually needs to be specified within the credential policy, which was one of the TAE qualifications. So having a look that you either have one person who meets it all or collectively they're meeting that. I would also recommend that if you're using any type of external provider for validation, that you actually ask for some type of validator profile or the evidence to actually show that they hold these competencies and meet the credential policy. And we've been asked numerous times during audits to actually supply evidence of how we are, you know, vocationally current or how we have the credentials. So I would recommend that if you are getting any external people to undertake it, or anyone internally that you might not have that information for, that you actually retain it on file. And then there are just some other areas, sorry, I should make sure that you're aware, as Harmony mentioned, around the TAE credentials. So making sure that you're aware of those too, and that you're using the correct people in which can undertake the validation. And that one also does specifically talk to having a first cohort review conducted by an external person. And with validation of assessment judgments across any products, making sure that the overall outcome or that outcome of that assessment validation is not solely determined by the person who has either designed or delivered that training and assessment being sampled. So steps in validation of assessment judgment. We would recommend that you actually look at your student data and having a risk-based approach. You can actually confirm your validation procedure first of all, which should outline that information. If not, I invite you to go and have a look at actually creating one that can be clearly documented. If it's not documented, then it's likely that people might not be aware of how things are done internally, or you might leave open to ambiguity or potentially some inconsistency. So I would recommend that you have a documented procedure, and then before beginning undertaking validation of assessment judgments, you actually confirm the validation procedure. Again, that's very important because of the less prescriptive methods of validation or the outcome standards themselves. Number two, looking at confirming the assessment tools and the actual methods to be validated. So looking at, have I got all of the assessment tools that have actually been used to make that judgment? Have I got any assessment methodology or reasonable adjustment policies or even assessment policy to ensure if there's any guiding information on that, I can review it before undertaking the validation. Then actually looking at step 3, which is identifying the method for sampling. So while it does remove the nature of sampling and has removed that, we would still suggest as a best practice method that you look at coming up with still what you would internally call a valid sample. And looking at that from a risk-based approach and how you prioritize the validation of assessment judgments. Again, I would align it very much to ASPA's risk priority ratings where possible. If there are items on that risk priority rating that aren't relevant to you, then I would look at stakeholder or student feedback. I would even look at the industry. If there's refresher requirements, for example, for something, or something is a unit is very legislative based that constantly changes, I would recommend that you do that first. A good one is Diploma of IT. No one really knew what ChatGPT or AI was about 2 or 3 years ago, and now everyone is using it, and how that is always evolving would likely mean that you might take a risk-based approach and actually undertake validation of that sooner rather than other units. Things like units that have placement or potentially put students into risk areas would also, in our view, warrant you to undertake them at a higher frequency. Number 4, confirming your records management. So all the records that you actually have, looking at the students that you're actually going to be sampling, and making sure that again, that assessor has not made the sole judgment for those students, that you've if that assessor has been involved in that judgment, they're actually using that collective team as mentioned. Number 5, identifying continuous improvement methods. So ideally, you should have a set of validation assessment judgment tools that have prompting questions that will really inform what it is that you're looking at. So things like, are the questions clear? Do they provide how many examples, etc. And actually from that, identifying continuous improvement methods. So if students are getting a question wrong, for example, or the question isn't, or instructions aren't actually clear, or not aligning, so the instructions provided to a student don't align to the actual observation checklist, well then I would question the student is being instructed one way, and then you're actually, as an assessor, observing something a different way, and they should align. So identifying those continuous improvement methods and actually acting upon them, or actually putting them on your register to act on them later. I'm not saying that you have to act upon each identified improvement every single time it's identified. You can group them and have a compliance or self-assurance calendar that actually speaks to the frequency in which you will then update the assessments. But if you are identifying them, you should act upon them, and you can determine internally what that frequency means to you and how often that's going to be based on what's actually achievable for you. And then making sure too that you're aware and looking at any other type of WHS or other legislative requirements that might be applicable as well. So some of effective validation questions for you. So is there enough and sufficient evidence? Is that evidence valid? Is it allowing us to support that judgment? Are the questions clear for students? As a student, would I know exactly what to expect from this assessment? What you expect from me in terms of performance? Do the benchmarks actually, or marking guide actually align to the question? I see very numerous times in audits where the question it says one thing, and then the answer that's provided, or that benchmark that's provided, is something completely different. So I would recommend looking at both the students' questions or the tasks as well, and the actual benchmarks that are provided. And has the mapping tool and marking guide been effectively, or been used effectively, to actually support consistent and accurate assessment decisions? Also, I would recommend looking at the actual evidence. Is that evidence valid? Is it meeting the principles of, rules of evidence? Is it actually allowing you to support that judgment of competence? And that could be supporting it through either being a direct piece of evidence or potentially supplementary. But making sure that it does have the depth needed, and it is quality evidence presented. So looking at your overall validation framework, what types of documents should you include? Now, I want to make this very clear that these are just guidance pieces that we've seen that work well for our clients. That's not saying that you have to implement these, but looking at looking at documented evidence is definitely important. ASCWA's new requests that we've been seeing come in from 1 July aren't overly prescriptive. In fact, some of them are just a kind of one spiel document. I'll use the example of continuous improvement. So it'll have 2 continuous improvement, and then it won't give you any guidance. So essentially, it's just they want you to actually reflect on, well, what do you do internally to meet continuous improvement, and what documentation within a framework of documents, practices, checklists, etc., allow you to meet the requirements of that, and in the context of your delivery and the resources that you have access to. So these are some examples of what we would recommend. A validation policy and procedure, the validation register, so documenting in one kind of snapshot what you have achieved or what you're going to achieve in terms of validation, pre-validation review or reports, and then validation of assessment judgments reports as well. ASQA's current requests for audits for validation, we have seen a consistent approach to this, thank God. It seems to be that they're asking for a validation register or similar document, and they are also asking for 2 units of competency that have been reviewed. They're either been reviewed through pre-validation or validation of assessment judgments. They don't give you guidance on that. They just say 2 units that have been validated as per your validation register. So that's what they're currently requesting. Please note though that they do take a risk-based approach, so they could change that request based on the context of your delivery, but that's kind of what we've seen across various different providers at this point in time. So the validation policy, I would recommend that the validation policy provide a purpose and scope if you're going to implement one. It talks about the frequency and the scheduling, and that's in line with your actual scope of registration. That's to make sure that we're meeting that 5-year cycle that Harmony mentioned earlier, the main change that has occurred around that frequency. Looking at a risk-based approach, so the qualification you're delivering, maybe it's your student cohort, maybe it's ASQA's risk priority ratings, whatever that might be, and however feedback or whatever feedback you're using to inform that, making sure that that's really clear of what you're using and how you've come about that approach and why you believe it's suitable to your RTO. And the personal requirements, so personnel in terms of credentials, what they need to hold, and then if there's any independent requirements for those TAE products as well, and then how you're going to use that information or use that information of those outcomes of the validation. I would also recommend that the validation in the scope, if you're going to take a 3-layered approach actually, or 3-activity approach, actually speak to that as well. If you're going to, whatever approach you're going to take, it actually does speak to that approach. The validation register, so 1.5 explicitly states that the validation must be informed by that risk-based approach that I mentioned. So risk to training outcomes, the changes potentially in training products, and feedback from industry, etc. So I would recommend that they be prioritized more. While most validation registers normally traditionally captured kind of what was validated and when, the new standards actually expect you to also demonstrate that why a particular training product or size was actually selected and that level of risk associated with it. So I would recommend that you have that captured within the register as well, where possible. And including where you can directly the register transparency, making sure that it provides transparent information. It's a clear snapshot. It provides evidence of compliance with that risk-based expectations, and that someone internally is actually accountable for updating that or scheduling the validation. So this should also be detailed within the policy. So if you have it detailed in the policy, then you could remove it from the validation register, but someone essentially does need to be accountable for that activity internally. And also looking at things like any succession planning. If that person's in that role is no longer available for that activity or can't undertake it, who undertakes it in their place? Essentially documenting the what, why, how, and when is really going to allow you to have a clear trail, and then the supporting evidence, of course, but really allow you to have a clear trail for auditors showing that you have that systematic quality approach. So there are just some identified fields that we would recommend that you have within your validation register if anyone's looking at creating one or updating them, and they include the risk level, the risk factors that you've identified, the validation type, the rationale for sampling sizing if you're going to include it, and then the actions and monitors that are linked to the actual risk. So looking at implementing, if you are going to go off and implement a validation framework, we would recommend that you schedule regular validation meetings where possible and where you have the resources to do so. Again, regular could be, well, maybe you undertake it quarterly, maybe you undertake it biannual. It actually really depends on what's going to be achievable for you, but making sure that everything is within that 5-year cycle. Again, if you have 1 unit of competency, for example, and that's the only unit you deliver, and that unit isn't in a high risk qualification, well, then maybe you might only do validation activities every year or every 2 years. And that could be absolutely appropriate given the context and that delivery. So it's really important that you analyze them and identify what's going to be achievable for you. And making sure that you select someone, as I mentioned, that accountability piece. So making sure not only do you select the right people for the assessment, but you're actually looking at selecting the representative assessment samples. So getting a good sample across numerous different assessors or across different training products as well. Using standardized validation tools and forms, this is a really important one that I would recommend. How are you able to show that you're having a consistent approach among different validation or validators will be quite important, and having a standardized document will allow you to actually achieve that. It will also provide as a prompt if you can write it in such a way where it actually guides and provides guiding questions to the validator on exactly what it is they should be reviewing. That also flows into things like stakeholder engagement. So if you don't have anything currently captured in your industry or stakeholder engagement forms that speaks to assessment improvements, I would recommend that you add a question or two, what would you like to see in the assessment, or if they've reviewed it, do you believe that the assessment methodology is suitable to the industry? Or maybe you come up with a better question that's really focused on what it is you want to get from them. But I would recommend that you look at adding something. Documenting validation outcomes and improvements is also quite important. Again, always making sure that we've got the evidence on file for it and that it's available and that we're actually actioning any improvements. And then trainers train actual validators or assessors in the actual process. I know that there is a unit within the TAE that speaks to validation, but we see often that trainers and assessors don't understand validation and what it actually means to validate and how an actual auditor would validate. So I would recommend that you invest in them and actually give them the skills and knowledge to be able to undertake successful validation. So common pitfalls and tips for success. So there are a lot of pitfalls, probably not enough space on the slide to put all of them, but not one that we see very often is not validating to the depth and the breadth required to gain meaningful feedback, or actually just completing a tick and flick exercise on a form, a standardized form. I invite you to actually look at the meaning of the words and look at students' answers and how they're actually writing their responses. That will give you a lot of information into, well, are these questions actually appropriate and are they aligning to the intended outcome? Also, common pitfall is assuming that tools that are purchased from off the shelf or vendors that they don't need to be validated. ASCWA are not of the same opinion. Any tool that comes to your organization, whether you've developed it internally or you've actually purchased it, should go through a validation process to ensure that it's actually going to be meeting the training package requirements, various principles of assessment, rules of evidence, etc. And then we also see validation tools without any context, or they're reviewed in that isolation, so without considering any industry or the cohort or that environment. So as I mentioned, looking at that information and gaining that before you actually begin the validation activities. And so some tips for success, we would recommend that you use a diverse range of people where possible. That gives objectivity. You will find some validation components can actually be subjective. What one person might believe, another person might not. So actually having more people can help with that. It should where possible, incorporate industry expertise. And please keep in mind that is in terms of 1.3 and 1.4, but in particular 1.5, you have to include those credentials. So just keep that in mind. And making sure that you look at the full assessment system and really treat validation as not just as a set and forget, or you kind of only come to it as a compliance obligation. Oh, we've got to do validation activities, it's been 2 years. Actually allow it to inform your kind of broader continuous improvement. You'll actually find that if you undertake the pre-validation and the moderation, by the time you go to do validation of assessment judgment, you hopefully won't have many gaps or limited things to change. That doesn't mean that there won't be improvements identified, sure, and there will likely be, but in terms of gaps or issues, hopefully you've already eliminated them by the time you get to that final step. Why does it matter? Well, of course it matters because of our students, and we want to provide them with quality education. We want to make sure that they are actually industry ready graduates and that they have the skills and knowledge required to succeed in that workplace or in their job role. It also allows you to show as an organization your commitment to them and to continuous improvement, and really allow your organizational reputation to be further strengthened. It also will allow providers, and I mean external providers, employers, or industry, to know that you've got quality job ready students as well. Finally, there's some tools and tips, if anyone, or sorry, some tools, ASCL's practice guide, and then some, please keep a note that these ones here are resources that are against the old standards. However, there is still some good ideas around the kind of depth and what you need to be looking at. So I would invite you to have a look at those. TAC, which is the Training Accreditation Council based in WA, also have some good YouTube videos that are available if anyone would like to use them for professional development or have a look at them later. So overall, the key takeaways, I would make sure that validation is not just a kind of compliance obligation. It is a critical part of your compliant assessment system, making sure that you're using the principles of assessment, rules of evidence as your foundations for review, and informing or where possible engaging industry and relevant feedback into that process too. And making sure that you're engaging in regular and well-documented activities as well. If it's not documented or there's no evidence to suggest it occurs, then it's kind of your word against the auditors. So I recommend that you look at that. Use findings to drive improvement and ensure that it's fair as well across all students. And then making sure that you're supporting your assessors through ongoing training and resources where possible too. Empowerment into your staff and making sure that they're aware of what to do when they're validating is really critical, and that they understand their role and responsibilities within the assessment system. So I'm going to hand back over to Harmony now, but thank you so much, and if anyone has any questions, I look forward to them at the end.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that overview, Katya. That was excellent. What I'll do now is show you how we're implementing the best practices you mentioned along with these compliance changes inside eSkilled, SMS, and LMS. So Katya's covered the what and how of good validation, but the reality is many RTOs, that management layer is still scattered. So spreadsheets for registers, shared drives for evidence, calendars for sessions, and separate records for validator credentials. That fragmentation is where compliance risks creep in. So wrong sample sizes, missing independence, outdated tools, or a register that doesn't show risk-based rationale. So our goal with eSkilled is to make the right thing the easy thing, with validation governance embedded into the system and the workflow. We recognize that RTOs need more than just checklists and spreadsheets. you need a system that builds compliance into the workflow itself. So by the end of 2025, we'll be releasing a fully integrated validation management system inside eSkilled SMS and LMS. So this will give your RTO a single place to run, to plan, run, evidence, and report on validation in line with the revised standards. So I just wanted to give you a quick behind the scenes preview of what we're developing to simplify the validation process. One of the first things you'll notice in the new validation management system is the compliance dashboard. So this gives you an instant snapshot of where your RTO stands against the standards. At a glance, you'll see whether you're on track to meet the 3-year requirement of validating 50% of your scope and the 5-year requirement of 100% coverage. You can also see if you have events scheduled where the participants don't meet the requirements under the standards, training products with no validation scheduled or that require attention. But it doesn't just tell you where you are right now, it also looks backwards and forwards. So backwards in that it confirms whether your current assessment practices are compliant with the standards today. So performance indicator 1.5 and 1.6, and forwards to check whether your validation schedule is structured and risk-based. So it will keep you compliant into the future. And when auditors come knocking, you can demonstrate compliance without scrambling because you've got that evidence tied to the standards. So with just one click, you can export reports that clearly show your validation activity over the last 3 or 5 years, ready to present at an audit. Another powerful feature is the risk-based scheduling, which we've touched on today. It aligns to those new standards requirements that we laid out, which requires validation to now be risk-based rather than quota-driven planning. So this means that high priority or high risk areas like aged care, early childhood construction, or high volume qualifications, for example, are surfaced as a priority. So your validation schedule ensures you select those high risk programs and units first. So this will allow your RTO to more easily demonstrate compliance with the new standards. With the inbuilt risk-based approach, every unit in the student management system will have these inputs: a risk rating, so assigned by RTO based on risk, completed assessment sample sizes. ASQA has a really handy calculator for this, and rationale for both the sample size and the risk rating. Programs will have fields for risk rating, which is auto-calculated based on the unit risk for that program, units to validate sample size, which is the number of units to validate per training product, and the rationale for both the risk rating and the unit to validate. And this is really important because it's not enough anymore to say we validated 2 units, so that covers the whole qualification. That approach is no longer defensible under the new standards. Instead, the system ensures that you can clearly show what you validated, but the why and how you determined the risk and sufficient sample sizes, allowing you to provide that critical evidence at audit. So next, let's talk about the validation team, which we've covered off today. We know one of the most common compliance gaps is forgetting to check whether validators meet requirements. In our system, that risk will be eliminated. When you add validators to a validation event, the system automatically checks that they have the right assessor credentials, industry currency, and professional development. It also flags if you're missing an independent validator, so someone who hasn't delivered the training or developed the assessment tools. And to back it all up, you can store the evidentiary documents in the validation event itself. So things like a validation report, completed assessments, validated assessment tools, and any supplementary documents. So this will give you a complete audit trail with everything linked to the event itself. One of the biggest frustrations that RTOs tell us about the validation process is how scattered the evidence can be. With eSkilled, everything's centralized. You can upload student samples, assessor guides, blank assessment tools, completed validation reports, and any supplementary evidence directly into the validation records. So you don't have to hunt anymore through shared folders, old email threads, or spreadsheets for all of that evidence. Everything ties back neatly to the unit, the register, and the event itself. So when it's time to prove compliance, you don't have just the paperwork. You have a structured system-based audit trail that's ready to go. And finally, the system makes scheduling seamless. From the dashboard, you can create validation sessions in just a few clicks. The unit details auto-populate, you assign the validator, and the event automatically syncs to whatever calendar you're using, whether that's Outlook, Google. And to make sure that nothing slips through the cracks, the system sends automated reminders about upcoming events. That way your team stays on track and you reduce the risk of missed or delayed validation sessions. It's simple, it's integrated, and it takes the stress out of managing compliance timelines. So we're targeting this release for the end of 2025. If you'd like an early demonstration or more information, just let me know in the chat. Okay, and lastly, moving on to the free AI-assisted pre-assessment validation prompts that we promised. One of the biggest challenges in validation is obviously the time that it takes to do the validation. We've developed these AI-assisted validation prompts that our instructional design team has been using internally. So we wanted to share those with you to help you streamline validation, cut down on the admin, and get a clear compliance picture in a lot less time. I just wanted to emphasize that these prompts are only for knowledge assessment. We're currently refining and streamlining skills-based assessment validation report prompts. However, we're not quite ready to share those yet. We're still refining them. So when we are, we can. So stay tuned for future VETtalks webinars. So the purpose of these pre-review AI validation prompts are to identify general gaps in assessment using prompts to assess candidate instructions, marking guides, benchmark criteria, and answers, to reduce validation time to around 15 to 20 minutes for a full validation report, and to provide a baseline template that can be further customized and refined in line with unit requirements. These prompts do 4 key things. They categorize the knowledge assessment questions into essay type and quiz type so that you can validate the right ones with the right approach. They match each question to the mapping tool, checking candidate instructions, marking guides, and benchmark answers or criteria against the knowledge evidence. They validate knowledge assessments against mapped requirements, context, and AQF level. And finally, they generate a structured validation report, flagging whether a question is a full map or has a gap, and makes recommendations for how you can fix those. So to run these prompts, you'll need 3 things. Firstly, your knowledge assessments, including candidate instructions, the marking guides, and benchmarks. Secondly, your assessment mapping tool, which contains the knowledge evidence mapping, and the AI prompt, which we'll provide to you by email following the session. So here's how it'll work in practice. Upload your assessments and mapping tool into your chosen AI tool, whether that's ChatGPT or Gemini. Step 2 is you create a new document, and when ready, run the categorization prompt, which will separate essay type and quiz type questions. And third step is you run the validation prompt on each category. So both will validate against the mapped requirement, context, and AQF level. The essay type prompt checks clarity and precision of the benchmark criteria. For quiz type prompt, it focuses on the structure and presentation of the quizzes. So within 15 to 20 minutes, you'll have a full validation report identifying maps, gaps, and recommendations. Validation for us internally used to take around 8 hours. So this has obviously been a game changer in giving us some incredible efficiency gains. But it's really important to note you still need a qualified validator to review the output. But these prompts should give you a structured, repeatable process that will save you time. So these prompts are fully customizable. You can adjust them for your own context, industry, or compliance approach. The document will contain both types of prompts, as I mentioned. We'll share this with you via email in the next day or so, so please check your junk mail in case it gets filtered. So that concludes the main part of our session today. I don't think we really have time for the Q&A, unfortunately, but what we'll do is we'll take all those questions, and Katya and I will formulate written responses to those and share that via the email follow-up. I just wanted to touch on a special offer that eSkilled is extending, as well as Hawkeye. So if anyone is interested in looking at a new student and learning management system with the validation features that we mentioned, that I mentioned today, we've got an offer for 15% off your first year subscription. So the voucher code is VETtalks, and that's valid for 60 days. And from a Hawkeye perspective, Katya, did you want to talk to yours, or I can talk to yours?
Yeah, I'm happy for you to talk to Harmony. Thank you.
Yep. So Hawkeye has generously offered 15% off their validation services. So if you want some expert advice on how to go about this, they're the people to speak to. The voucher code is eSkilled-validation, also valid 60 days, and that's the link to go to, or like Katya said, you can reach out to her by email or LinkedIn to take them up on that. And last